Come on, Johan. Tell him to stop breaking the rules and play the right way.
The big secret to breaking the rules is to make it look as though you're following them. So, what sort of plans do you have for the Earth?
Who knows? Why should I care? I'm just gonna destroy everything anyway.
All right, that may be the most metal opening I have ever had to a podcast. Certainly more metal than I am normally.
Dark.
Well, it is great to be back with you. My name is Ben Dyer. I'm here with my buddy Mark Lehman, and this is Tabletop Tune-Up, where we are here to talk to the GMs out there in the world, and we want to cover some amazing things for you this week. This week, as you might guess, we're going to talk about how to break the rules. Mark, do you like breaking rules?
No.
Not so sure. Maybe.
Not sure. A little bit.
Sometimes it feels fun and transgressive. Other times you go, why did I hurt that person that way?
I'll tell you what, though. There's fun ways to break them. And maybe we'll find some of those out today.
I think we will. So this week we're going to talk about how to know the rules first and break them well. House rules are something you're going to see in lots of different games. And where we want to start with is just that whole bit about knowing the rules first. So before you house rule stuff, before you introduce your own rules to customize a system, probably one of the first things to do is make sure you've really read it well. I don't know about you, Mark, but I have had examples of games I've played, people I've played with, game masters that I've played with. They hadn't read the book really carefully, and all of a sudden I started seeing all kinds of rules come out. And I thought, wait a minute, this system, if I'd read this more thoroughly than the GM, I'd been like, wait a minute, this system it's not supposed to work that way, or this is already covered by that other rule. Did he not read that other rule?
Or maybe they took rules that they house ruled from previous games that they've played, and they're thinking, well, I can just translate it to this game. It may not be universal.
I've been playing a bit of Pathfinder 2 occasionally, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's very different from that and from D&D. And so I find myself trying to do stuff in Pathfinder 2 that the feedback I get back is, oh, there's a feat for that, or, oh, you got to do that later, or, oh, that's going to take you 10 minutes or something like that. And I'm just kind of going, okay, I just didn't know the system very well. So
I had pages of house rules we used to use when we played second edition. That's just how we played the game. I think that's how everybody played the game, but they do not translate over to fifth.
One of the things about systems is that some of the systems that we'll play with, some games are more susceptible to modification. Some games welcome the house ruling player, and I think some editions of different games do as well. Other games, they're very tightly designed, and if you change something, you're going to probably break it, or you're going to break something if you're not very careful with it. So, I think that's an important thing to do, is read the system carefully and then kind of get a sense of what kind of game it is. Like, what kind of thing are they trying to achieve with that? Systems are built around specific kinds of gameplay. Some systems are very narrative. Fate, for example, is a game that is very narrative. You don't have like agility and strength and constitution and all those things. You might have a trait like high school football coach. That's intended to stand for a body of traits. Like maybe you could have a commanding authoritative presence. Maybe you would be fit, or maybe
really good at making kids do jumping jacks.
Really good at making that one kid climb the rope and try to get to the ceiling of the gym.
Making kids cry.
So other systems are very crunchy. Pathfinder's a little crunchier than Fate, as you might say. So it's important to know not just what the rules are, but what kind of gameplay that system is built around, because that's the kind of gameplay that players of that system are probably interested in playing with.
And speaking of the players, they really need to be on board with these modifications too, Ben. This changes their relationship, not only to the game, but to their characters. And that's really important. So make sure they're on board. Talk with them about it.
Yeah, it's really critical to make sure that everybody at the table is happy with it. It's just the same way that we were talking about when we talked about starting a campaign well. It's really critical, just as with story, just as with the setting that we're all going to play in, that people are on board with the rule set and they understand how they work, and that's consistent and reliable and interesting. So let's talk about how to do house rules. To start with this, there's a couple observations. Firstly, when you look at your average RPG, it's not just one set of rules, usually. I mean, there are exceptions, but in a lot of games, there's a system for skills, say, and a system for how you work with your ability scores, whatever form those take.
And they can be kind of compartmentalized. You look at Pathfinder, it has a really neat, interesting skill system. And you can almost take that skill system and plop it down in some other games. You'd think, but be careful.
It's not a bad idea, but you do have to study. You have to kind of know the rules first for both the home system and the destination system if you're going to start pulling systems and putting together. But the point I'm making here is that RPGs tend to have multiple systems going on at once. And so it's important to know how interdependent those systems are. If you're playing a death and healing mini game, if you're trying to modify the way that death and healing mechanic works, you probably need to know, well, how does this connect up with, say, the character's constitution scores or whatever is standing in for constitution in this game? That's one kind of thing to observe. And the reason why we're observing that is because when you start changing it, there's a difference between house rules, which change those mini systems, and some other categories of rules changing. For example, Mark, you make a distinction between house rules and homebrewing. As with most things on this podcast, this is kind of just our point of view. Other people may use different terminology, but when you talk about the difference between house rules and homebrewing, what is it that designates something as homebrewing?
In video game terms, I would think of a house rule as a quality of life improvement, whereas homebrewing would be a full-blown DLC that you're paying money for.
Right.
Homebrewing is way more involved, and it can involve the world building, it can involve the rules, it can involve the skill systems, combat. We're talking about minor tweaks, quality of life, things that should improve the game or make the game more fun.
For example, I remember once upon a time you and I were playing earlier editions of D&D, and they didn't really at that time have an herbalism mechanic. And we saw this really interesting set of herbalism mechanics in Rollmaster. And we thought, hey, let's bring this over and enrich our D&D game. So having an entire herbalism section where you might be out around in the woods, you would find herbs, you'd collect some, and then you could use those to brew various kinds of tonics and potions and healing drafts and things like that. That's adding a whole dimension to the game. That sounds like what you mean by homebrewing. Is that right?
That would definitely fall into the homebrewing category.
Let's now distinguish between, on the shallower side of this thing, house rules versus stat blocks. Now, you sometimes mess with your monsters, don't you?
I'm known to do so, yeah.
You may have at times sent goblins after us that were not rules as written.
Yeah, we're talking here about things behind the GM screen, making changes to monsters, things of that nature. A lot of times, though, we're playing with players who've maybe played before, and they might know the stat block of a goblin, and you want to do something a little different. You want to give them a little bit different experience. I'm not really going to consider that a house rule. I'm going to consider that GMing. I'm going to consider that challenge design. That could be increasing their hit points. There's all sorts of things we do behind the screen.
It's interesting you mentioned that, players knowing about the stat blocks and all those other things, because of course they do, especially if any of them are also GMs. You'll see that at regular in-person tabletops where you pick up a miniature and you put it on the table and everybody goes, okay, I see that is a such and such creature. And then what's funny is that if you start doing what you're doing, if you start giving it maybe some features it didn't have, heck, if you even just give it a different weapon, which is the easiest thing in the world, all of a sudden players kind of go, wait, what? What's happening?
It's always fun to see that one player who's maybe you suspect has the book open on his computer monitor when you're playing online, and you can kind of see, almost hear his brain going, but he can't really say that, can he?
No, he can't. Because then you're like, what? Do you have the book open? Are you cheating right now? Actually, is that cheating? Is it cheating for players to look at monster stats?
I used to say it would be, definitely if you're in person and you're at the table. I highly discourage that. But I also let them know I'm going to be messing with those stat blocks.
Okay, so now we've got these distinctions on the table between homebrewing, which is kind of this thicker concept that's got to do with building whole new additions to your game. And then there's also this idea of making the little tweaks that we might think are going to change the nature of the challenge for players in a given encounter. By the way, I'd also include in that list things like traps. You might look and see there's a needle trap or something like that that's got a huge poison effect. And you think, well, gosh, it's going to kill somebody. I don't want to do that. But you can always weaken the poison or strengthen the poison or change some aspect of that trap if you want.
Do you mind if I go back to one thing you had mentioned? We were talking about behind the screen with the GM. When we're talking about a little bit of a distinction there between what the GM does behind the screen and this house rule that we're going to be talking about, one of the main differences is that Even the GM is going to be abiding by whatever these house rules are.
Right.
These are things that we're all in agreement on.
So, Mark, now that we've got these distinctions in mind and we can see the difference between homebrewing on the one side, challenge design on the other, when do you start feeling the impulse to change a rule, to tweak something in the gameplay?
For number one, if something's inhibiting the player's fun, that's the first sign that I say, well, maybe something can be changed to make the game more fun for that player, for all the people at the table, for myself. That's usually when I start thinking about a rule change.
That feels like the golden rule of house rules. Any kind of house rule is really about enhancing the fun. Frankly, I think it's about enhancing the kind of gameplay that the players want, which I take it is why they're all sitting down. That's what they're going to find fun. So I think there's a convergence there between the types of gameplay and the fun that people are going to have. But I mean, I think fun is the key thought here.
We could also be trying to avoid some sort of hindrance within the rule system, which we can kind of go over a little bit more later. But there are some things in the game that might slow the game down. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not fun. It's just you got time economy you got to think about. So maybe a rule is something you're going to want to change there.
Let's actually go to some examples real quick for house rules at your table. What are some rules that you have in general? We're going to look at some different ones according to different systems. I'd like to hear your thoughts. But what are some rules that pretty much every game you play, you're always including?
Well, no PvP is one that I have in any game I play.
Yeah, same here.
I don't think people have fun with that. Maybe when I was in junior high.
Yeah, I think it changes the character of the game too, because PvP gameplay is usually a war game at that point, right? That's when you're going to go play, Warhammer or BattleTech or one of those kind of games. Role-playing games have a much more team-based aesthetic.
Correct. And also, like, if I have a large group, try to stay away from summoning stuff. I don't need more creatures on the board. It just takes up way too much time.
People might think that's a rule that's specific to fantasy games where you're summoning monsters and things like that, but there's a lot of other games that have summoning or summoning-like rules. I remember playing a superhero game where people could bring in all kinds of stuff. They could bring in followers. They could bring in you could make a character that was functionally like Nick Fury from S.H.I.E.L.D., right? And he could have a gazillion followers that could show up if he wanted them to. And guess what? How's your initiative tracker going now? Now that you've got, 36 new characters on the board and you're like, ugh.
Yeah, Cyberpunk with all these drones flying around. I mean, yeah, you're right.
I played a lot of Hero System. That's a game where different people have different speed scores, for example. And so one of the house rules I instituted was making sure everybody had the same speed score. Speed basically meant how many times you could act in a given combat round. You could have people who are normal human beings, maybe heroic type characters who had a speed of like 3 or 4 and they could act that many times in a round. But then, of course, you could also have speedsters who could go super fast and they could go 10, 11, 12 times around maybe. That meant that players, functionally, some players could be acting a lot and other players would be spending a long time waiting for their turn to come up. And that was just no fun for the people that were waiting for their turn a long time.
In Pathfinder, one of the rules that was really common to drop was you don't have to confirm your crits. There was nothing worse than like rolling a 20 and then having to confirm that and rolling a 2 or a 3 and then just like, what a bummer.
Definitely robs you of that thrill that you get when you see the 20 come up.
Yeah, that one came up a lot.
Well, in D&D, I know you also did some stuff with card-based initiative rather than D20 systems. How did that work?
I had an in-person game where we were playing, I think it was first edition.
Like the Granddaddy system?
Yeah, this was like when I first moved here out to Minnesota about, 6 years ago. I found a group and we wanted to try out the first edition D&D. And we played a Western and I used cards and we used the card initiative system.
Usually with these things, there's some kind of advantage that dex-based characters have. So how did you account for that in this otherwise randomized system?
I think for every 2 points that they had like a plus in, a dexterity score, I think we allowed them to roll or draw an additional card. So those really fast players might be drawing 1 or 2 cards more than the other players.
Well, I hope this is giving you guys ideas. Sometimes these are house rules that we make because we think the system is too mean to people. I know, for example, in our games, we will reroll 1s on hit point dice when people level if we're playing D&D. Also, I know a lot of people find the idea of drinking potions as a full action is, it's like not how they like to play the game. I've seen a lot of people house rule that drinking a potion, healing potions usually, that's a bonus action that you can do on your turn. Again, is there a right or wrong answer to that? No, it's whatever makes the game more fun for you.
And your table.
And your table. Let's talk about how to change the rules now. When you're thinking about changing a rule and you're looking at these different systems that RPGs have, how do you get started with this? What is it that you're going to start looking for? How do you know when changes are good or bad? Mark, what's a starting thought here you might have?
Start small. Take a look at a rule that you think you'd like to change. Talk it over with your group. Measure the effects on the game system. See if it's going to have some unintended consequences. And that's kind of where that discussion comes in. You're going to be talking with your players, and they might say, "Well, hey, wait a second. This could affect my character." So have that conversation.
Yeah, it's important that they come along with you on this, because you're going to be bound by it. They're going to be bound by it, and we're changing the basic medium of the game that we're all playing in. So it's important to make sure that this preserves the kind of gameplay they're sitting down to play with you. One of the things I would add is make sure you're aware of the mathematical assumptions in the game. Every game that you're going to play, game designers have sat down and thought about that math, and they've thought about how likely success should be. They've thought about how often you might be successful versus failing, and what difficulty is like, and how difficulty scales. So one of the things to do is think about how the math changes if you do make certain kinds of house rules. Some of the systems I've played in that use, say, a 3d6 task resolution mechanic. Again, Hero System is an example of that, but I think Traveler uses 2d6. People sometimes want to adjust that system to use a d20 if they've come from, say, a d20 system like D&D. And the thing to remember about that is, hey, if you're doing that, you're changing the probability distribution of the stuff at the ends. So when you're using multiple dice, you're going to get a bell curve of probability that's going to favor whatever the middle of that distribution is. So on 3d6, it's 10.5. So you're most likely going to get a 10 or 11, and you're very, very unlikely to get a 3 or an 18 on 3d6. On a d20, every result is equally probable. So it's not that you can't do that stuff, but think about how importantly different that stuff is and what other kinds of effects it's going to have. All of the modifiers, for example, in a d20 system won't make sense in a 3d6 system like that, because when you move the 3d6 target number 2 or 3 points off of whatever it is, you've changed the probability of success significantly.
Why do I feel like Laura Dern in the car with Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park?
Listen, I will say it's kind of nerdy. You can kind of go down that rabbit hole or whatever. There are really good things, though, that will kind of model this stuff for you. Look, I'm just saying, if you start screwing with the math, expect the math is going to, catch up to you at some point.
That's right. Don't be afraid to just fix and refine these rules that you guys make up too. It's a living, breathing rule. Sometimes you just want to throw it out.
Yeah, I think there's a nice point in there. There's a kind of a point that, like, you're going to test these rules out in gameplay, and it's entirely possible that you can go through a whole session, maybe not even a whole session, and everybody goes, "Oh, this was a mistake." And it's always okay to back up and go back to the base rule set.
And also revisit this with your group. Hey, how's this rule working? Is it working out for everybody?
Yeah.
Get feedback.
Very good points. Well, okay, so these are our thinking about how to change the rules and how to house rules. Start small, be aware of the math, and then don't be afraid to iterate and to redraft. Check with your players, try it out for a game system, throw it away if it's not working for you. There's an important thing about when to do this. In general, don't introduce house rules during gameplay. If you're in the middle of a combat and you're like, "Hey guys, I got a house rule," your players are going to be very unhappy.
On that note, let's talk about breaking rules in the moment.
Yeah. So that's not exceptionless advice. There are some circumstances where it's actually a good idea to break rules in the moment. And this is where we get like the rule of cool or fudging dice. So one of the things to maybe start with, though, is it's usually going to be in the player's favor. If you break into a moment in the middle of a game and all of a sudden you're like, "Hey guys, I'm going to house rule this thing that's going to take away something from you," players are going to be understandably ticked off. If you are going to do that, you got to do it very carefully and very diplomatically, and make sure that everybody's on board with it.
This is kind of breaking the fourth wall of the game, in a sense.
That's right. So when you do this during gameplay, again, it's important after the game's done to make sure you discuss that with everybody and that everybody was happy with the outcome and so on. Now, let's talk about 2 moments when everybody is tempted to break the rules a bit, and we're going to call the first of these the rule of cool. Mark, tell me about the rule of cool.
Man, the rule of cool is just essentially when a player is doing something really creative, doing something really awesome, and you want it to succeed. Everybody at the table wants this to succeed. So you might say, give yourself inspiration on this attack, or give yourself a +5 on this ability check. You might be just trying to push this because they came up with this great idea and you want them to have some success. You don't want to just give it to them, but you want to load that dice in their favor, right?
That's right. I almost feel like it's conspiring with the players against the dice. It's a kind of conspiracy on behalf of the story, if you will.
It's also like telling the player that I appreciate what you're doing. You're rewarding the player for a great idea.
That's right. Players need to know what kind of game master you're going to be, and one of the best ways to tell them is by the kinds of situational modifiers and penalties that you're imposing. So if you start incentivizing certain kinds of very creative behavior, then that's the kind of behavior you're going to see players come back and start trying more and more of. Let's talk about the other side, the dark side. Let's talk about when the dice get their revenge, and all of a sudden your dice are hot that night. They're rolling crits. They're killing players. They're dropping bodies. Like, what do you do at this point, Mark?
We're talking about fudging dice here.
Do you break the rules?
You can, and some people do. I do not. I'm not a dice fudger at all. In fact, I roll my dice in front of the players so they can watch that thing tumble around the table and the anxiety that brings. But when I was younger and I was learning the rules and learning the games, I didn't know what I was doing. Sometimes I might put a whole bunch of monsters on the table, and I was like, I really overestimated this monsters that I got on the table. I screwed up.
Yeah, when you overestimate the player party, you have to back out somehow.
I'm not going to give that GM any flack for doing something to fix that situation. If that includes fudging the dice, so be it.
Fudging the dice is something that you'll do if you've made a mistake as a GM about the relevant challenge in the combat or in the encounter that you're in, and you realize that you kind of have to own the outcome of the encounter. You have to kind of find a way to make it right. So here's my thought is, if you understand that and you're content with that and you want to fudge the dice, great. But if you're sort of feeling like that may be a little bit unfair, or that you don't want to break that part of the game, then it's also possible for you to spend time preparing and thinking through other kinds of remedies, trapdoors, story hooks. Maybe when the whole party drops, there's some new faction that comes in and drags their bodies away and maybe imprisons them and heals them to health so that they can sell them off as slaves or whatever, right? You've got that kind of power as a GM to write your way out of that problem.
And we're going to talk in future episodes about encounter design. And we're going to talk specifically about how to create encounters so you don't have to fudge dice. You can ramp up and down your encounters in other ways. We're going to cover that in some other episodes, but let's just say fudging dice, if you're new, this might be something you might have to use for a little bit. But be open with your players. Let them know sometimes, hey, I'm learning. I overestimated this encounter. So I apologize if, and for God's sake, do not get caught fudging dice. But be open.
Great. First rule of fudging dice, you do not fudge the dice that the players can see. Fantastic. All right. Well, hey, you know what? It's time for another tune-up segment, Mark. We've got our friend and GM, Jeff, who writes, I've been in dungeons and also have made dungeons where the monsters don't really make sense. How can I make sure the dungeon I'm running or making is actually believable? Where's my monster getting food? Why? And why is he there? Is the dungeon dying or expanding? Does it have economic, trade, or strategic importance? Would one set of monsters kill or eat another set? Mark, I feel like this is one of those age-old questions we get. You ever go into a dungeon and there's all 5-foot doors, and you get in there and you find like some dragon in there that's 30 feet wide, and there's no way he could have gotten in there. Like, what do you do to make sure that your dungeons are kind of rational and that they make sense?
Why does this feel like every first edition dungeon module I ever played was like this? I don't know if I questioned it a whole lot when I was young, but I think as I got older, I just remember thinking like, how does this make any sense?
I certainly think player expectations have changed over the years. So I think it makes sense for us to think about the rationale of a dungeon.
Yeah.
And to think about it as something that has its own internal logic, A dungeon is a generic term, after all, for some location. That location was built there for a purpose. And so for me, when I'm doing world building and I'm thinking about dungeons, the first thing I think of is, why is it here? Was this a fortress of some kind that was guarding a trade route, or that was on a frontier of some lost kingdom? What was the purpose of this thing?
The lore of that dungeon is very important to the ecology of that dungeon. So think about its history. Think about the people this dungeon's traded hands over the years. Think about the different people who might have resided in this dungeon. Start crafting from there. But then you could also start thinking about other things about like the creatures that inhabit that space. You can mix and match from all sorts of different types of creatures, such as a winged creature, say, versus a foot creature. Maybe you have vegetarian creatures versus carnivores, living creatures versus undead, or intelligent versus non. You can kind of mix and match some of these creatures, and you can see how some might be able to get away from others. So they could technically inhabit a big giant cave space.
Yeah, you could have on one level of a dungeon some Duergar who are working their forge, but then a level or two deeper, there are Myconids who are living their mushroomy lives. One of the things to think about too is, how do people access the dungeon? How do people enter and exit it? And are there other kinds of conditions in the dungeon, right? So don't just think about the creatures, but think about what else is true of the dungeon. If this was a place that was a fortress, does it still have an armory? Are there some of the doors reinforced? Are there natural traps and things that are put in there to deter attackers?
There should be all sorts of ways to kind of access this place at different types, because how does food get in there for these creatures to eat? Maybe there's vents for the smoke to get out that creatures can kind of crawl in, not just the traditional cave.
Was this dungeon something that was a natural feature that somebody came in and occupied, like a cave? And there's lots of variations on natural features that you could do. Or was it something that was built, or was it kind of a hybrid? Maybe there was a fortress built on top of a cave.
And also dungeons should have all sorts of either natural or unnatural barriers that are kind of keeping things a little bit at bay. It could be a river that runs through part of the dungeon, or maybe it could be something magical like a fungus that has some toxicity that some of the creatures just don't want to go near.
So, Jeff, I guess our answer to your question is, when you're thinking about how to make the ecology of your dungeon rational, start with why it was there, who came in next, and what else did they find there, what kinds of things started growing up, how did they come to be reasonably good neighbors, and then look for other things to tune up your dungeon that are not creature related.
And let's be honest, if this were in the real world, would this work? Probably not. But you just have to suspend your player's disbelief enough to pull it off.
That's right. It's got to be enough that they don't feel like this is patently ridiculous, but trust that your players will come along with you.
Well, thanks for the tune-up, Jeff. We appreciate your email.
And if you'd like to send us a tabletop tune-up idea, something that we can spend a few minutes brainstorming on and helping you with, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at tabletoptuneup@gmail.com. Until next time, keep those dice rolling.